I am going to give a short presentation about the Scottish regulatory system and in particular about the scheme for certification of design of building structures in Scotland, which is run by Structural Engineers Registration Limited. First question, has anybody heard of Structural Engineers Registration Limited? Put your hands up. Good. I'm pleased to hear that. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to give a very brief introduction about the regulatory system in Scotland, the legislation that underpins it, and then I'm going to talk specifically about certification of design and the scheme and some of the requirements of the scheme. Just a bit about me, very quickly. I'm a chartered engineer, 35 years. I think actually it says 40 in the presentation, which is more correct. I've been an approved certifier of design since 2005 in Scotland. I've been a member of the Scottish Registration Board, which administers the scheme in Scotland since 2007, and since 2012 I've been the chairman of that body, and I'm also chairman of a similar body that is for the scheme in Jersey that we operate, and that's been since 2016. Anthony mentioned, I think, the Great Fire of London, 1666. I'm going to take you back to 1119. Okay? So we've beaten you in Scotland. The Royal Borough of Berwick introduced building regulations, and they were initially concerned with structure, fire, health and sanitation. That sounds familiar to everybody, I'm sure. And similarly to the way it developed in England, a lot of the boroughs in Scotland started to introduce their own regulations, and it was the Guest Report in 1957 that decided there needed to be a rationalisation of all these regulations across the country. Again, I think we beat you by 1957. And that led to the Building Scotland Act of 1959. Currently, oh, I've done the same. But I've got it back. The legislation that underpins the system in Scotland comprises the Building Scotland Act of 2003, and there are then the building regulations themselves and the cannily titled the Building Procedure Scotland Regulations of 2004. The thing to note is the system in Scotland is very different. The regulations themselves, the requirements, are quite similar, but the system is different. The first thing is that the system is preemptive. It's designed to see that the proposed work meets the regulations. And that means you have to get what is called a building warrant before building work starts. And that is the key difference between Scotland and the way the system operates in England. And the point here is any person who carries out work without a building warrant is guilty of an offence under the Act. There are two important provisions within the legislation which is worth just touching on, which allow for the fact that it is a preemptive system. One of those is the amendment to warrant, and that is required before work starts on areas of construction that do not follow the proposals in the original approved plans. Okay, so if you're going to do something different, you need to get an amendment to warrant. And if changes are made during construction without an amendment to warrant, these could be subject to a building warrant enforcement notice. The other thing is staged warrants. Now, as everybody knows, decisions are not made until late in the day. And you might say, okay, how do you get a warrant before you start building, because we never ever have all the decisions made. And so the legislation makes provision for a building warrant to be applied for and granted in stages which you agree with the verifier being the local authority. Okay? And what that does is you get the warrant for the whole project, but it's on a condition that work on these identified stages don't start until the necessary information has been submitted and an amendment to warrant has been granted. Okay, so there is a process by which one can deal with lengthy projects, decisions that are made late in the process. And the last thing, again, is the completion certificate. A completion certificate is needed to confirm the building has been constructed in accordance with the relevant building warrant. The relevant person for ensuring that, the relevant person is responsible for ensuring the building work is carried out correctly. That is usually the building owner. You might say, is the building owner the right person to be able to do that? But that's another question. And the point, I think, is also made that verifiers, local authorities, cannot regularly or sufficiently monitor all construction work to check that the regulation requirements are being met. There are just not the resources to do this. And so reliance is placed on the relevant person who is saying it's all been built in accordance with the warrant. And it's important to note that it's an offence to submit a completion certificate that is known to be false. And it's also an offence to occupy a new building unless the relevant completion certificate has been accepted. Okay? There are two very important roles defined within the legislation. One is the verifier and one is the approved certifier. Now, verifiers, their role is to protect the public interest by providing an independent check of applications for building warrants. Okay? Now, at present in Scotland, the only appointed verifiers are the 32 Scottish local authorities. They are the verifiers. But the legislation actually allows for the appointment of private verifiers should this be required sometime in the future. Approved certifiers. The Act establishes a role for suitably qualified people, businesses or other bodies to certify that certain design or construction work complies with the regulations. Okay? And there are two roles designated. One are approved certifiers of design, which I'm one, or was one, and approved certifiers of construction. The important thing to note is that the certificate issued by an approved certifier must be accepted by the verifier. The Act states that in determining the application, the verifier must accept the certificate as conclusive of the facts to which it relates. There are other provisions within the legislation that allow for the verifier to question it, but this is the key thing, is that normally the verifier will accept a certificate provided by an approved certifier. All of this is set down in this nice blue document, the procedural handbook, if anybody wants to go and find it on the Building Standards website. So talking about certification, currently there are actually 7 certification schemes in Scotland. There is one, the certification of design for Section 1 structure, which is operated by SER. There's certification of design for energy, certification of design, again for energy, certification of construction for electrical installations, for another one for certification of construction of drainage, heating and plumbing. So there are a number of schemes in existence. So going back to 2004, the Scottish Government appointed Structural Engineers Registration Limited to provide the scheme for certification of design of building structures. SDR is a collaboration between these great learned institutions, but the important thing to note it is that it is wholly owned by this learned institution. Okay? And SER provides schemes for both Scottish Government and to the states of Jersey. So, the scheme is set down in this document, the scheme guide, which can be downloaded from the SER website. And this describes the operation of the scheme, the management of the scheme, criteria for membership, and the obligations of members, and it is based on the certification handbook, which is a similarly branded blue book. So, the approved certifier, what are the criteria for membership so that you can be an approved certifier? You have to be a member or fellow of Istructe or ICE. You have to have had 5 years post-chartered experience in the design and construction of building structures. Be able to demonstrate a knowledge and experience of the Scottish Building Standards system. You must be employed by an approved body. An approved body is a firm that is a member of the scheme that has agreed to abide by certain obligations of the scheme. I'm not going to go too much into approved bodies. You must agree to submit details of your CPD on an annual basis. And you must also agree to have your certification activities audited. And that is the thing that focuses the mind, is that somebody comes in and looks to see what you are doing. So the duties are, you must be satisfied that you're competent to certify any particular design. You've got to do it in a methodical manner. You must keep adequate records. You have to ensure the design is complete and it's been appropriately checked. You must be satisfied that the design complies with the relevant building regulations, because effectively you are acting as the building control officer with respect to the structural requirements of the regulations. What mustn't you do? Well, clearly you shouldn't sign a certificate for work that does not comply with the regulations. That might be considered reckless. Or sign a certificate if the design is incomplete or has not been appropriately checked. And the extract from the Act there says any approved certifier who issues a certificate containing a statement which is false or misleading or recklessly issues a certificate is guilty of an offence under the Act. The approved body, just quickly talk about the membership requirements. You must have at least one certifier. There must be auditable checking procedures to ensure the quality of certification activities undertaken by the body. Agree to maintain adequate professional indemnity, insurance, provide access for certifiers to relevant legislation and so forth. And you must make provision to promote the CPD of the certifiers within that body. And you must designate a certification coordinator who is the person who's going to check that the requirements of membership are being fulfilled. Okay? So, duties of the body: provide the environment that supports the certifier, allocate adequate time and resource to the certification process, make provision to ensure that the approved certifier who they employ is adequately protected from financial loss, because there is a thought that the certifier could be held to be personally responsible because of their role under the legislation. Okay, so this is a key thing, is making sure that that person is protected. And you must also, there's a requirement that you must review the risks associated with any appointment and ensure that they're based on appropriate contractual terms and conditions. We've heard about that this morning. Yep. We're now going to talk specifically about the certification process, and this is important. The declaration on the certificate says, I certify that, having exercised reasonable skill, care and diligence, blah, 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 for the design proposal for the project described in the application. That is the scope of the project. And it says the structural design complies with the regulations with respect to standards 1.1 and 1.2. Okay? Now, if we look at standard 1.1, standard 1.2 is not dissimilar to A1, A2. It says every building must be designed and constructed in such a way, blah, blah, blah. The key thing is it says every building, okay? It doesn't say anything about the structure of the building. It's talking about the building must be constructed, designed and constructed in accordance with structural requirements. And that's important because when you look at building, the building is to be designed and constructed. The building is defined within the legislation as any structure or erection or part thereof, whether temporary or permanent. Okay? Now that, you can read that, and that's quite a broad definition. And from the structural engineer's point of view, and this is the important bit, it therefore follows that it can cover things like cladding, glazing, internal partitions, ceilings, staircases, protective barriers, and a whole host of other things that maybe structural engineers are not used to dealing with. Okay? And it's a key thing that needs to be borne in mind for anybody who is going to be doing work in Scotland. I think that actually if you delve into the wording of the legislation in England, it is not too dissimilar in terms of people's responsibilities. The key requirement of the scheme is the auditing of scheme members. And the main purpose of the audit is to check that the design and detailing is being carried out and appropriately checked, and the project is being certified using an acceptable methodology. The purpose of the audit is not to check the design, okay? The members of the scheme are the people who have to make sure that the design is adequate. The auditors go in to see that the processes are all correct. The audit also checks to see that members are not certifying out with their competence and that they are undertaking appropriate CPD. Am I doing all right at the time? Auditing is set down in our procedures for auditing, which again is available on the SER website. It describes how the audit will be undertaken. It defines 29 criteria against which certification performance of approved certifiers is going to be assessed, 10 criteria against which the performance of approved bodies is going to be assessed, and it sets down a whole load of requirements. And I'm going to take this one. For example, protective barriers. The certifier shall satisfy themselves that adequate details of any pedestrian or vehicle barriers have been prepared and that there are sufficient calculations to demonstrate their design. That's what the certifier has to do, is to make sure that this level of performance is achieved. And then there are a list of major non-conformances and improvement issues, which are findings which are examples of the certifier not having met the level of performance that's required. And the outcome of the certifier audit is determined by a review of the following. Now what we do is we look at individual projects, and we score individual projects for the way that has been certified. And the score for each project is taken, and the mean and maximum scores are looked at. We look at the proportion of auditable items out of those 29 for every project, which result in findings, what the severity of those findings is. We look at the certifier's proposals for corrective actions for making sure that that doesn't happen again, and whether or not corrective actions from previous audits have been implemented. And we look at previous audit history and CPD. And that results in an outcome which will be anything, another audit anywhere in the range of 1 to 5 years, okay, depending on how well you've been doing. It could lead to a warning of suspension of membership pending mentoring and a review of proposals for improving performance. It could result in the suspension of membership, and it could result in the withdrawal of membership. Information to be made available at audit, copy of the certificate, the drawings that were used for the purposes of certification. That would include the engineers, architects, and any third-party designers. So the auditors will look at those. They will look at the certification plan scoping document, which is the thing that sets down that it's been done in an organised manner, calculations, specifications, and evidence that the design has been checked. Crucially, the certifier must maintain records which include information on how compliance with the building regulations was established. That is stated in that clause in the procedure regulations, okay? Main issues, and I'm not going to go into too much depth on these, but I think you will understand why these are issues. Changes that occur post-certification and then require certification to be done again. We've talked about amendments to design and all sorts of things this morning, fees, implications of that. That comes up. Late production of information by people putting pressure on the certifier. Client saying, I need this certificate, and he's saying, I can't certify it, I don't have the information from these people. And changes to the certifier. The certifier is supposed to be a holistic role that looks over all aspects of structure in the building. There will only be one certifier for that building. If for any reason you need to change the certifier, then the new person who comes in has to take over the role and take over the responsibility for the certification of that whole building. So it's almost starting again. So it leads to issues. But it means that responsibility, you know exactly where the responsibility lies. Okay, this is just the last few slides. How successful has the scheme been? Well, research commissioned by Building Standards Division of Scottish Government back in 2014 said that of the 5 schemes currently in operation, the SER scheme is considered a substantial and clear success, with the majority of building warrant applications accompanied by a certificate. Okay? We're proud of that. The scheme's been running, as I said, since 2005, so the number of approved certifiers for the various years has remained fairly constant between around about 390 and just under 500. It's gone up a little bit, down a little bit, but fairly constant. Number of approved bodies is not quite so constant, and there has been a fluctuation between the number of people at firms, big firms that employ a number of certifiers, and small practitioners, particularly sole practitioners. Okay. And the number of certificates issued has also remained fairly constant. It rose very quickly at the beginning and then has dodged around about 20,000 certificates per annum ever since. It's been on the rise over the last few years, which is also good. So just to recap, I've quickly talked about the regulatory system, talked about the legislation, building warrants, verification and certification, talked about the scheme in detail, approved certifiers, scope, audit process, issues, and metrics of success. Thank you.